Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this morning for this really incredible opportunity for this important conversation. I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman. I'm the Director of Adult Education here at Central Synagogue. And this really is a watershed moment that we are seeing in our beloved Israel. And I am so appreciative that you all care so much about what's going on to show up and engage with these questions. This morning, you'll be able to ask questions, have your questions answered by Michael Koplow from the Israel Policy Forum. So please leave your questions in the chat box. We are going to ask that everybody except for our speaker and our moderator to remain on mute through the conversation, just so that we can hear what they have to say. We'll share your questions with our guest at the very end of the program this morning. So it is my pleasure now to introduce you to someone that you may not have met yet. Rabbi Joy Levitt is the Interim Director of Adult Engagement for Central Synagogue. She is already such an incredible part of our team. She'll be our host and our moderator this morning. Joy, please take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. And I want to thank you, Sarah and Marina from the Adult Engagement team for organizing this morning's very important discussion. I think the numbers on the Zoom testify to a deep and abiding interest at Central Synagogue for what's happening in Israel. I want to begin by thanking our guest, Michael Koplow, who is the Senior Policy Director at the Israel Forum, which, as you know, is dedicated to advancing the goal of a two-state outcome in order to preserve Israel's future as Jewish, democratic, and safe. Michael is a great friend to the Jewish people of mine, and time, unfortunately, does not allow me to cite his many articles and accomplishments, but I would refer you to his Koplow column, which you can find on the Israel Policy Forum website. He's a great friend to Central Synagogue, has done this with us before at these kind of watershed moments, as Sarah said, and we're grateful, Michael, to you for agreeing to join us on such short notice during what is an extremely challenging time for those of you who are engaged deeply in this work. I want to start by acknowledging that today is Tisha B'Av. It is the 9th of Av, the darkest day on the Jewish calendar, when we commemorate the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem brought about, at least according to some rabbinic commentators, because of the senseless hatred between Jews. Much has been said and will probably continue to be said all day today about the coincidence of this date and the internal fighting in Israel right now. And I'd like to come back to that in a bit. But now, Michael, for those of us who have had a hard time understanding exactly what has happened and how we got to this terrible moment, could you give us the background to the vote in the Knesset this weekend and kind of bring us up to date?
Sure. So thank you, Joy, and thanks to Central Synagogue for hosting, which I'm always honored to participate in. So on Monday, as everybody here presumably knows, the Knesset voted 64-0 to eliminate the Supreme Court's ability to use reasonableness in judging government decisions, judging cabinet decisions, and judging decisions of individual ministers. So how did we get to this spot, and why is it such a big deal? So when the Netanyahu government first took office in late December, they announced that they would be undertaking what's now familiar to all of us, a judicial overhaul. And there were a number of elements that were in the judicial overhaul. There were 5 main ones that Justice Minister Yariv Levin announced 6 days after the government took power, and eliminating the reasonableness standard for judging government decisions was one of these 5 things that he said the government was going to do. It was not, however, the first thing that the government proceeded with, because the reasonableness standard was not considered to be the top priority. The top priority for the government was changing the way in which judges are selected in Israel. And so the early fight was over the Judicial Selection Committee. And The protests that started way back in January, we're now 7 months in, started over this issue mainly of the Judicial Selection Committee, the idea that the government would have power over selecting all the judges in Israel without any check. And as the government started to pass legislation, that's what they focused on. And that led to the clash in the spring where Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that he was firing Defense Minister Yoav Gallant because Yoav Gallant had spoken out against the efforts to change the Judicial Selection Committee. That's when the protests really reached their peak. You had hundreds of thousands of people who turned out literally in the middle of the night to protest the Gallant firing. And then 2 days later, Netanyahu went on television and announced that he was suspending the entire process. And instead, there were going to be negotiations under the auspices of President Bougie Herzog to figure out how to move forward in some sort of consensus. Those negotiations took place during the Knesset recess over the Passover, the Pesach break, and kept on going. And while those negotiations were ongoing, there was no movement on the judicial overhaul proposal, not on the Judicial Selection Committee, and not on the reasonableness standard. So what happened next? What happened next was partially the fault of the government, and I think partially the fault of the opposition. The Judicial Selection Committee, which had not been transformed, has to meet. And in order to meet, it had to have 2 representatives from the Knesset, because the current selection committee has 3 judges, 2 members of the Israel Bar Association, 2 ministers, and 2 members of Knesset. Those 2 members of Knesset get elected by the Knesset. And so the Knesset went to elect the 2 members who would be representatives on the committee. And when they went to elect the 2 members, the process got a bit fouled up. Normally, there's one person elected from the coalition and 1 person from the opposition. But this time, members of the Prime Minister's coalition were openly saying that they didn't think any opposition members should be elected. And so a number of them were running, and it was contributing to a situation where it was going to be possible that an opposition member would not get elected, and that was going to throw everything into a crisis. And so Netanyahu tried to engineer a situation in which nobody would be elected, because there's an arcane rule that if only 2 people are running, you vote either for or against, and if the people get more votes against than for, then nobody gets elected. Instead, his plans went awry. The opposition candidate indeed got elected to the committee, but the coalition candidate did not. It's unclear whether Netanyahu engineered that or not. It's unclear whether members of his coalition voted against his preferred candidate without telling him, as a way of signaling their displeasure. But in any event, the coalition candidate didn't get elected, which means that the Judicial Selection Committee was 1 person short, at which point it was not going to be convened. And the opposition leaders, Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid, who had been participating in the negotiations at the president's residence, at that point said that they were breaking off negotiations because until the Judicial Selection Committee could actually be convened, they weren't going to negotiate. I think they did that out of a sense that they were in a position of strength, but the impact that it had was that once the negotiations were suspended, Netanyahu and his government announced that they were going to move forward with the judicial overhaul again, and this time they decided to start with this reasonableness clause. The theory being that the reasonableness clause was the least controversial of the things on the table. And so this moved forward, and it passed 64-0 on Monday. And as I mentioned, what it does is it removes the power of the courts to judge not legislation, but government action, administrative decisions, either by the full cabinet or by individual ministers, according to this reasonableness standard. Up until Monday, the court was able to strike down decisions that it found to be extremely unreasonable. Going forward, it cannot do that, and the way in which it was passed, and I'm sure we'll get to this, also creates sort of the next crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I want to stay on this reasonableness clause because for Americans, this sounds a little fuzzy and hazy, and I guess in the larger scheme of things, many people, both on the right and the left, have said that the Israeli Supreme Court needed to be reformed. That didn't seem like it was only a kind of right of center position. So if that's the case, why did this become so contentious when a lot of Israelis believe that the Supreme Court needed to be reformed?
So you are correct. Many Israelis view the Supreme Court and the judiciary in general as something that needs to be reformed or overhauled in some way, shape, or form. The problem is that the reform that the government announced when it took power wasn't really an effort to address some of the problems or some of the perceived overreach. It was an effort to completely shift the balance of power over to the government entirely, and to make it difficult and in some cases impossible for the judiciary to have any oversight of the government at all. Now, there's always a debate to be had in any system, in any democracy, about where the balance of power should lie. But in Israel, it's a bit more difficult than in other places because Israel is distinctive in a number of ways. The first way in which it is distinctive is that Israel has no constitution. It's one of only 3 democracies in the world that does not have a written constitution. And so that means that checks and balances that exist in constitutional systems, such as our own here in the United States, don't exist in Israel in the same way. To the extent they exist, they are more a function of common law. They're more a function of the courts over time, really assuming powers for itself that will act as a check on the government. The second way in which Israel is distinctive is that it is a parliamentary democracy with only a unicameral legislature, only one chamber. And what that means is that there is no check between, for instance, in our system, the House and the Senate. There is no possibility of one chamber being held by one party and one chamber being held by another. In Israel, there's only one chamber. And furthermore, because it's a parliamentary system, that one chamber collapses the executive and the legislature into one branch. So in this country, and in Israel as well, although wrongly, as I'll get to in a minute, we talk about 3 branches of government, right? We talk about the executive, which here would be the president and all of the government agencies. We talk about the legislative, which here would be Congress, and we talk about the judiciary. In Israel, you have a 120-person Knesset, and the same...
If the only issues are of law, then the judge can decide them.
Sorry. The same majority that forms the coalition that controls the Knesset also forms the government. So right now, the current coalition has 64 seats out of 120 in the Knesset, which is how you got to the 64-0 vote the other day. The opposition members all walked out in protest, but even if they hadn't, it would have passed 64-56. The same 64 people who control the Knesset then also elect the prime minister and form the government. So you don't actually have a separate executive and legislative branch, you have one. When those two are collapsed into one, then the only check on the government becomes the judiciary. And so upsetting that balance in Israel becomes a bigger deal than if you do something in the United States, for instance, to upset that balance. And so if you take some of these individual components of the judicial overhaul piece by piece, some of them look worse than others, but some of them don't look particularly radical. And I'd say up top that the reasonableness clause is one of the ones that on the face of it does not look particularly radical. The question is, what happens next? And if you pass the whole package or even part of the package, then you are in a fundamental way reordering the system of checks and balances in Israel based on an election. And I think that's why people view this as such a big deal. I'll also note that there were different versions of the reasonableness law that could have been passed. The one that was passed is a pretty broad one, not the broadest one that possibly exists, but a relatively broad one. And there probably would have been a way to pass this even just with the government's votes and nobody from the opposition, in a way that would have been less controversial had they narrowed its scope a bit.
I want to move to this so-called special relationship between the United States and Israel, and refer you to Tom Friedman's column this week in the New York Times, the title of which was "Only Biden Can Save Israel Now." As you know, it was an open letter to our president that argued that Netanyahu's coalition undermined our shared values and strategic interests. I wonder if you agree. How do you see the role of the United States right now in this critical juncture? And how seriously damaged is this special relationship, if at all?
So to start with the question about how damaged is the relationship, and then I'll talk about what I think the role of the United States is. So I don't think that the U.S.-Israel relationship is going to look or feel damaged tomorrow or next month or next year. We are obviously and evidently in a period of tension between the two sides. I think anybody who's been watching understands that there is tension between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's manifested most starkly in the fact that the Prime Minister has not been invited for an Oval Office meeting, and the invitation that was extended last week when President Herzog was here to Prime Minister Netanyahu wasn't for an Oval Office meeting. It was to meet before the end of the year, which is a very purposely ambiguous way of putting it.
Reasonable, but
my guess is that they will meet on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in September. But I will be very surprised if Prime Minister Netanyahu ends up taking that meeting in Washington at the White House. And so, that's an obvious manifestation of it, but we've seen all sorts of statements from the president, from the Secretary of State, from members of Congress, expressing concerns over the judicial overhaul and what it does to the U.S.-Israel relationship in terms of shared values. So, we've seen that. We've seen other periods of tension in U.S.-Israel relations. I don't think that this one is particularly fraught, certainly not unique. But that doesn't mean to say that there isn't danger. And actually, it's what I wrote about for my column today. It'll come out probably in an hour. The reason that the U.S.-Israel relationship is special, what makes it unique, is this idea of shared values, shared democratic values. Otherwise, the U.S. and Israel would have a security relationship like the U.S. has with plenty of other countries. What makes the relationship here different isn't that it's just about security. It's not just about assistance or intelligence. It really goes down to all levels of government and society. It's why you have governors leading trade missions to Israel nonstop. It's why you have sister city agreements with Israeli cities all across this country. There are all sorts of ways in which this relationship filters down beyond just the president and beyond just Congress. And the reason it filters down that way is because of this sense of shared affinity. If Americans no longer view Israel as sharing the same democratic values as the United States, all of those other things are going to go away over time. It's not going to be overnight, I hate the metaphor of the frog boiling the pot, especially because actually I don't believe it's true. I feel like the frog would probably jump out before it gets to the boiling point.
and let's not test it. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Let's not test it. But if we're going to use that metaphor, even though I don't like it, that's what this is going to be like. We're not gonna wake up one day and all of a sudden it'll be kind of starkly different from the day before. But it's going to take place over time, and it absolutely is going to erode the U.S.-Israel relationship. Now, I'm not suggesting it's going to happen simply because the Knesset eliminated the reasonableness standard on Monday. But for many Americans, certainly for many American Jews, I say that based both on polls and anecdotally, and from all the time I spend speaking in the Jewish community, there's a real sense that Israel's democracy is somehow damaged. I think it's impossible for any Americans, Jewish or not, who are even just paying casual attention to this, to see hundreds of thousands of Israelis demonstrating in the streets week after week, month after month, and not have a sense that something is wrong with Israeli democracy. I think it's impossible to keep on absorbing the warnings from the president and members of Congress and not sense that something is going wrong with Israeli democracy and in this relationship. And once that idea gets cemented into people's minds, it is absolutely going to impact U.S.-Israel relations. Of that, I have no doubt. And at some point, it's also going to impact even the military and security relationship. We are very far away from the day where the United States is going to cut or condition security assistance to Israel, something that I should add, I think would be a very bad idea.
So you don't agree with Christoph's piece this week in the Times on that very subject, in which he's quoting Dan Kurtzer and Yossi Beilin as suggesting that aid isn't necessarily needed or very good for Israel?
So I'm not sure that the aid, the way in which we give it, is 100% needed. I'm not sure that Israel needs every dollar of the $3.8 billion it gets every single year. I do think that there are perhaps ways to restructure it, not punitively to Israel, but to focus on the things that Israel actually does need. Missile defense 100%, big ticket weapons items 100%, but does Israel need us to give them money for jet fuel? Could that be used perhaps for something better? I think there's a debate to be had about that. But I don't think it's a good idea at the moment to cut it, to condition it, to do any of this without a real intense conversation with Israel about what its actual needs are, and then figure out how best to meet those needs.
I want to remind everybody that the chat is open and people should feel free to put their questions in the chat. I want to move to the American Jewish community for a moment. A major Jewish leader remarked to me recently that the Jewish community still has access to the Israeli government, but no longer has influence. And this week, Ron Lauder of the World Jewish Congress took out a full-page ad in the New York Times to plead with Bibi and Gantz and Lapid to find a compromise. I found that curious. I'm curious, from your perspective, does anything the organized Jewish community say right now matter? And what should we as a Jewish community be doing now to support this country we love?
I think that the organized Jewish community for decades has had less influence with Israeli leaders than we believe. And I say that as the chief policy officer of an organization that was founded at the behest of an Israeli prime minister. The Israelis, no matter, and it's not just this government, it's not just Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think that they oftentimes respect the opinion of American Jewish leaders. I think that they certainly view American Jewish leaders as the key, maybe not this prime minister as much, but historically as the key to understanding what's going on in the United States, and the key to helping with the U.S. government. But I'm not sure that Israeli leaders have ever particularly cared or paid attention to what we on this side of the ocean think about their own internal politics, about their own internal situation. And certainly now it doesn't seem as if we're getting through. And the American Jewish community and American Jewish organizations, have not unanimously but overwhelmingly been I don't want to say not in favor of the judicial overhaul, but have certainly cautioned the government to move more slowly, make sure you have consensus, not to break things entirely. And certainly that has not been a factor in the Israeli government decision making or their calculus. I think what we should be doing in this moment is appealing not only to the Israeli government and not only to Israeli leaders, but to the Israeli people. I think it's important for Israelis to understand that American Jews are still very much in the Zionist camp, are still very much pro-Israel, are connected to Israel, view Israel as the Jewish homeland, and that we have a stake there, because I think it's important for many Israelis, for all Israelis, to understand that we feel as if we have a stake in their future as well, both for Israel's sake and for the sake of how American Judaism develops here. So I think the first part is showing that we support Israel. We are not going to walk away. We're not going to look at what's going on there and wash our hands of it and get up and turn our backs. We are not just as invested in Israel's future as Israelis, but just a hairbreadth below. So I think that's important. And at the same time, I think it's important for us to demonstrate that we stand with Israel because Israel is a democracy, and that even as we always will have a connection to Israel as the Jewish state, it would be naive to say that connection won't be questioned if Israel is no longer democratic. Israel as Jewish and democratic is the Zionist vision of Israel's founders, and it is the Zionist vision of I think the overwhelming majority of American Jews, and we're going to fight for that. And I think we need to keep on demonstrating that we have this voice and that we're going to use it, and that it's because of our connection and love for the state of Israel, and not because we want to force our opinions or our views on Israelis, but because the vision of Zionism that we hold so dear, really we believe is an important component of Israel's past, present, and future, as do many Israelis, and that's who we stand in solidarity with.
I hope everybody on this call has heard that call as our marching orders. I think we at Central Synagogue need to really think deeply, as we have for so long, about how we help one another maintain those relationships. And I thank you for that comment. Let's just spend a minute on the elephant in the room, right? Which is this expression Jewish and democratic has for a very long time been challenged by the reality on the ground for Palestinians. And once again, in this huge upheaval in which, as you said, hundreds of thousands of people are on the street, in some way, once again, the Palestinians have been left out of this conversation. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Up until 7 months ago, when we talked about Israel as Jewish and democratic, and we talked about the pressures on the democratic side, we were almost always talking about the Palestinians and the issue of Israel's 56-year and counting occupation of the West Bank. That is the issue that in the long term is going to threaten Israel's democracy. It's important to understand in the context of the judicial overhaul how this comes in, because there are different reasons that different actors in the government want this judicial overhaul. For Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think it's almost certainly about his legal cases and getting out of legal jeopardy.
Remarkably similar, right? Our countries at this moment on that issue.
Certainly have echoes of that here as well. I'll note that yesterday, a group of 11 Likud members, which constitutes a third of the entire Likud faction in the Knesset, introduced a private member bill to remove the Attorney General's authority over state prosecutions. There was an uproar, and the bill was withdrawn this morning. But I guarantee you that bill is coming back, and that really could only be advanced in the wake of the reasonableness standard being eliminated. Because if the Attorney General is fired, or if the Attorney General is stripped of some of her powers, that is the exact type of thing that courts in the past would have prevented due to the reasonableness doctrine. So for the Prime Minister, it's about his legal problems. But for many Likud members, and certainly for Hatzionut Hadatit, the religious Zionism party led by Bezalel Smotrich, the purpose of the overhaul is to make Israel's complete and permanent takeover of the West Bank easier to do. There are a number of things that this Israeli government put into its coalition agreements, spearheaded by Bezalel Smotrich and agreed to by Prime Minister Netanyahu, that cannot be done if the government's version of judicial overhaul does not go through. One of the things that the government would like to do is retroactively legalize illegal outposts in the West Bank. When I say illegal outposts, I mean outposts that are illegal under Israeli law, in contrast to the 132 settlements that are legal under Israeli law. Can't do that under current court guidance. It would like to build settlements on private Palestinian land. Can't do that under current court guidance. So there are many things that this government is prevented from doing in the West Bank. And Smotrich in particular has been very clear that this is what he wants to do and that this is why the judicial overhaul is so important. So, when we think about Israeli democracy and what is taking place, the concerns at the moment that are front and center are about checks and balances and the balance of power and the power of the courts. But it's really important to remember that the overhaul itself is not an end, it's a means. And it is a means to an end that is going to, I fear, leave Israel permanently as a non-democracy, because you simply cannot annex the West Bank, apply sovereignty to settlements, and not grant the Palestinians who are living there full citizenship. If you do that, then Israel is no longer democratic by any reasonable definition. And so for the Palestinians and for issues in the West Bank and for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, these deep issues still exist. You asked earlier a question I didn't answer, which was what's the proper role of the U.S. in this moment? My view is that obviously the U.S. has an interest in Israel staying fully democratic because of these shared values and because we want to protect the special relationship. But over the past half century, the overwhelming U.S. interest has been, with regard to Israeli democracy, has been about how you figure out how to resolve the situation in the West Bank, and ultimately how you get to leave Israel as Jewish, democratic, and secure alongside a Palestinian sovereign entity, which should be a Palestinian state. That is the core U.S. interest when it comes to these issues. And I would like to see the United States focus much more of its efforts on that, continue to speak out, in a very friendly fashion about the threats to Israeli democracy posed by the judicial overhaul, but to not lose sight of the bigger picture here when it comes to U.S. interests. And the bigger picture here when it comes to U.S. interests is absolutely a two-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Let's move to the protests, and then we'll begin to open it up to all of your questions. It's interesting that I suppose, to the extent that there was any strategy around these protests, there was a strategic decision to focus on the court and not on the Palestinians early on. I think that was not uniformly agreed to, but many of us have watched in awe as hundreds of thousands of Israelis from every stream and every ethnic community have tirelessly demonstrated for weeks and weeks, months and months. I told you earlier that I was struck by a video that Rabbi Nama Kelman of Hebrew Union College sent me this week that showed young Israelis cleaning up Sachar Park in Jerusalem following a huge demonstration. There was literally not a cigarette butt on the ground. Hard to imagine a United States demonstration in Washington in which that actually happened, but it felt like a metaphor for how deeply young Israelis feel about their country. So I noticed that there was not a demonstration yesterday, I think not in the immediate aftermath of the Knesset vote. And I'm wondering about your sense of the ability of the opposition to maintain this level of protest, and if not, since this clearly, I shouldn't say clearly, but wasn't effective in getting the government to consider the lack of consensus in the country, what happens next?
The government is counting on the demonstrations petering out. That's why when it picked things back up, it started with reasonableness, again, on the theory that this was the least controversial aspect of the overhaul. And they did what many of the folks in the opposition call the salami method. People are actually bringing packages of salami to protests. The idea being that you instead of doing everything all in one fell swoop, you slice things like a salami, right? Thin piece after thin piece after thin piece. And then if you do it that way, you blunt some of the opposition and you take away the potency of the demonstrations. I don't think that that's going to work. Based on what we saw in the lead up to the reasonableness law, where the demonstrations were larger than they had been. I think what we're going to see next, aside from the continuing weekly demonstrations, and I imagine that they will this Saturday night eclipse even what they were last week. What we're going to see is, I think, increasing IDF reservists who reject their service. That was obviously part of the lead up to this, but I think that is likely to expand. The protest leaders issued a statement today, calling for what they said is sort of moving from a holding pattern to offensive action. They stress that always means nonviolence. But I think that, included in that, they're trying to get people to adopt a tax rebellion, not pay their taxes. In addition to the increasing calls for reservists not to serve. I think that we're probably going to see many more general strikes, many more localized strikes in different sectors. All of this is going to increase the pressure on the government. Now, as you note, the government did not back down in the face of protests. It also didn't back down in the face of the issues in the IDF, although I'll note that next week there's supposed to be a number of classified briefings, both in the Knesset Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee, and also in the Security Cabinet on the state of IDF preparedness. That may start to become a bigger factor. We saw this week a number of credit agencies and big banks issue written warnings about the Israeli economy, including recommendations not to invest until further notice. I think that is going to have an impact as well. The government has dismissed all of these things up until now, but I certainly do not think that the protests or the opposition are going away. I think they're only going to intensify. And Prime Minister Netanyahu at that point is going to have a real decision to make. Whether he pushes forward in an effort to keep his government together, and whether he can withstand all this, or whether he chooses something different. The government is here until it calls new elections. There is no mechanism anymore for replacing an Israeli government through a vote of no confidence. The only way to do it now, since 2015, is through what's called a constructive vote of no confidence, meaning you have to vote no confidence in the government and then at the same time vote in a new government comprised of the current Knesset. So you have to form a coalition ahead of time. You can't just vote to bring it down. And that means that the way governments are going to fall in Israel are from the inside. So the prime minister does not have to call a new election for a little over 3 years. So it's possible this government will be there this long. If it is, it will only be because it has shunted aside any of the pressures and pushed this through. My own view, and this is the minority view among most Israel analysts, is that the government is not going to last another 3 years. But we'll see. I think the decisions for the government are only going to get more difficult going forward.
So my hardest question of all, I suppose, before we open up to these excellent questions in the chat, give me some hope, Michael. What's the hope here?
This is the question I've been getting for months on end. So I think there are a few things that leave me hopeful. One is simply the response of Israelis. Israelis are fighting for the vision of their country to which they hold dear. They are fighting for what they view is Israeli democracy, and they've been doing it for months on end in increasing numbers. And I've been to the protests in Jerusalem. I've been to the protests in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv perhaps more than Jerusalem, but these are not monolithic protests. It's not only Ashkenazi elites. It's not only secular folks. It really does cut across. You see this both in polls and you also see it at the protests and in different places. And so Israelis are standing up and they're fighting for what they believe in, and it's not just one sector of Israelis. The idea that this is all entirely the old secular Ashkenazi elite that founded the state trying to preserve what power it has left is absolutely false. So, that gives me a lot of hope. And anytime you see civil society and a democracy enacted this way, or in a non-democracy enacted this way, I think it's a very hopeful sign. Second, I think that this Israeli government, whatever you think of the need for judicial reform, and 100% some sort of reform is needed, there seems to be little question that the Israeli government really overreached in a large way. And I think that is going to inevitably produce a backlash among Israeli voters of all stripes, to bring things back to the center for a bit more moderation. We talk all the time, it's almost a throwaway line now about, this being the most right-wing government in Israel's history. I think that's true, but it's not simply that it's the most right-wing on all sorts of fronts, whether it's the judicial overhaul issue, whether it's the Israeli-Palestinian issue. This government is orders of magnitude more extreme than previous right-wing governments. And I think that extremism is it's going to take some time, but that extremism is going to have an impact in the Israeli system in a way that counterbalances it, not only on the left and center, but I think eventually on the right. And so we're going to be going through a tough period when it comes to Israeli politics and Israeli decisions, and frankly, the relationship between Israel and American Jews. But I think we're going to recover from it, and it's partially because this government has gone so far and is so extreme, that I think it will provide a pathway back once there is new leadership inside of Israel.
Okay, Sarah, I think we'll go to questions now. If you can, I've been just looking in the chat, they're excellent. So if you can...
Incredible questions from this community. Michael, the first question I'm going to ask you is maybe the most basic about what happens next. This is coming from Lois and from Steve and from Lenny. So what does it mean that the Supreme Court will hear petitions in September about this law? And what happens if they rule against it? Will the Knesset ignore their ruling based on this new law? How will the Prime Minister react if the court rejects or reverses this law? What's in store in terms of this legal challenge?
Obviously, no way to know for sure, but I'll present a number of potential pathways. So the Supreme Court said that it was going to hear petitions against the law in September. It did not issue a temporary injunction against the law. So there are a few ways this can go. The court can hear the petition and can decide that either it doesn't have the authority or it doesn't want to strike the law down. If that happens, then I assume the Israeli government will move very quickly forward with the next elements of the judicial overhaul, having to do with basic laws, having to do with the Judicial Selection Committee, having to do with making it more difficult for the courts to overturn regular legislation, because it will see this as a green light and a sign that it's on safe ground. Another pathway is that the court cannot strike it down entirely, but can narrow it in some ways. I alluded earlier to the fact that this wasn't the broadest possible version, but it was pretty broad. One of the reasons that it's pretty broad is because it applies both to government decisions, sort of policy decisions, and also to government appointments. It's possible that the court will say, it's fine when it comes to policy decisions, but not to appointments, or vice versa. It might also say it makes sense to eliminate the reasonableness standard for decisions undertaken by the entire cabinet, but not by individual ministers. So there are ways that it can narrow the law, but not strike it down entirely. I think if that happens, it will be very difficult for the Israeli government to ignore the court's ruling. And then pathway number 3 is that the court strikes it down entirely. And if that happens, it's possible that the government will just ignore it. That seems less likely to me. I think that the more likely path will be, because this was passed as an amendment to a basic law, the more likely path that the court strikes it down will be to then immediately pass another law that eliminates the court's ability to oversee basic laws. The court has never struck down a basic law, but it has heard challenges to basic laws. including fairly recently. So I think that if it strikes it down entirely, the next move will be to try to remove its ability to have any oversight of basic laws. I guess the fourth pathway, the one that I just said I don't think is likely, is the government ignoring it entirely. As I said, don't think it's likely, but that's not impossible. And that's the real black hole when it comes to what happens next, because we have no way of knowing if that happens, what takes place next. Will the IDF chief of staff listen to orders from the government, or will the IDF chief of staff listen to orders from the court? That is, when we talk about a constitutional crisis that can lead to absolute state collapse, that's the scenario. And so that's the one that I hope, will be avoided at all costs.
So many possibilities, some bleaker than others. So we have a question from Kay Levine and from Elliot about the vast majority of Israelis. They oppose this judicial reform. So why has that not translated into opposition within the Knesset, or greater opposition within the Knesset, or a call for new elections? And why have the more moderate Likud members who did protest the firing of Gallant, the defense minister, what happened to them? Where are they now?
So here's where the politics become tricky. Before this government formed, you had Likud members, during the cycle of 5 elections, you had Likud members who were willing to step out and challenge Prime Minister Netanyahu on various things that he was doing, and it did not fare well for them. The first person to do it was Gideon Sa'ar. Gideon Sa'ar challenged Netanyahu in a Likud primary leadership. At that point, by the way, Gideon Sa'ar, was probably one of the 2 or 3 most popular Likud members based on Likud primaries dating back over a decade. He challenged the prime minister. I think the final, if I'm remembering correctly, the final tally in that vote was 76-24 in favor of Netanyahu, and Sa'ar basically got booted out of the party and had to form his own party. And he's now sitting. He formed Tikva Chadasha, which then merged with Benny Gantz, and so he's now sitting in the National Unity Party, Hamachaneh HaMamlachti, alongside Benny Gantz. He's gone from Likud. Yuli Edelstein, who had finished first in the previous Likud primary, and had been the Speaker of the Knesset, he announced before election number 5 that in the future he would be challenging Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he immediately dropped in the next Likud primary from 1 to 17. So there is plenty of evidence for Likud politicians that going against Prime Minister Netanyahu or challenging him in some way is not going to go well when it comes to someone's political future. The second dynamic that's taking place is that, like all politicians, these guys want to be in power, and there is no alternate coalition available to them. If a group of Likud members said, "Hey, we are not happy with the direction that things are taking, the direction in which things are going," most of them, probably all of them, are unwilling to sit in a government. Perhaps with Labor and Meretz. They're certainly unwilling to sit in a government with Ra'am, Mansour Abbas's party that was part of the Bennett-Lapid coalition. So they don't view themselves as having other options. And crucially, when this government took power, one of the first things it did was pass a law that said no faction can break away from a party unless it's 1/3 or more of that party. So in the past, whereas maybe you could get 5 Likud members to defect, and then you've got 61 for the other side, because Likud has 32 seats, you now have to convince 11 Likud members to defect if they're going to break away. That's now part of Israel's law, and getting 11 of them, I think, is probably impossible, especially given the fact that over time the Likud list has become, I would say, more extreme than in the past. And so, you have a more extreme Likud combined with a law that makes it hard for moderates to break away, combined with a set of political incentives that really point against it. And we are where we are. And in terms of forcing new elections, as I noted earlier, there is no way to force new elections. There is no way to vote no confidence in the government and just go to elections. You either have to vote in an alternate coalition at the same time, or you have to wait for the government itself to call new elections. And given the polls right now, where Likud and this coalition together have 64 seats, the polls that were released on Tuesday show the same parties in this coalition, if an election were held today, two polls, one had them at 52 seats and one had them at 53 seats. None of them are looking to force a new election because they're worried they're going to be wiped out. So, right now their incentives are to just keep on the path that they are going on and hope that somehow they muddle through before they are forced to have an election in 3 years.
So the next question is about Israeli society a little more broadly. How will this law and then the whole host of proposed judicial overhaul laws, how will they affect women in Israel, LGBTQ communities, Palestinians, and other minorities?
So just the reasonableness law itself is going to have an impact in all sorts of ways. I'll give you even a recent example. For years now, on Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day, there has been a joint memorial service organized by Israeli and Palestinian groups for both Israelis and Palestinians who have lost family members and friends over the course of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Every year, that joint memorial ceremony is held in Tel Aviv, and Palestinians from the West Bank, who are the organizers, get permits to enter into Israel for that ceremony. Ahead of Yom HaZikaron this year, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, decided that he was not going to issue permits for the Palestinians to come from the West Bank to Israel to participate in the memorial ceremony. There was a petition before the court, and the court overturned Gallant's decision using the reasonableness standard. And their logic was that Gallant did not provide any rationale for doing it. He said his logic had been for security purposes, but didn't go deeper into that. And the court said every day 130,000 Palestinians enter Israel to work. The ceremony has been held for years and years. This is no different this year than previous years. And so without sort of a specific security rationale, it's not reasonable to just say security and it can't happen given how many Palestinians enter Israel with permits every single day and given the history of the ceremony. And so he had to reverse course. Now, if that were to happen today, there would be no way to reverse that decision. And I don't bring it up to say that Gallant was right or that Gallant was wrong. I bring it up to demonstrate that individual ministers can discriminate against different groups in lots of different ways. That was one that had to do with Palestinians. But if Itamar Ben-Gvir, in his capacity as national security minister, wanted to turn around tomorrow and say pride marches can't be held because it's going to be too difficult to police them. There's no way today, in the absence of reasonableness, for a court to step in and say, based on precedent and based on all the various things, that's unreasonable. So you can target at this point, not entirely, but in many ways you can target different groups and very specific and individual groups and even individuals as a result of the reasonableness law. And I'll also note it's not just about folks on who are considered to be part of the left, such as Palestinians or LGBTQ Israelis. There's a famous decision from I don't remember the year now, but it's at some point in the last 15 years where, using the reasonableness doctrine, the court ordered an Israeli municipality to build a mikveh, a ritual bath, because it had the funds to do it. It had the space to do it. There was a whole plan to do it. This community did not want more religious people in its community, and so it said, we're not going to build a mikveh. And the court stepped in and said that is unfair to observant Jews. So this isn't just about folks on the left. It's about folks who are also traditionally on the right. Without reasonableness, individual ministers have lots of power to target even individuals and take away their rights. And again, because Israel has no constitution and has no Bill of Rights, there are a few rights that are enumerated in the basic law on human dignity, but nothing nearly as expansive as you have here or as you have in other constitutional democracies.
So the next question really is about external considerations. Jamie's wondering if there's concern that the internal divisions that are now so publicly evident in Israel, if that will invite enemies of Israel to take advantage of the moment.
Yes, and I would say that we've already been seeing that for months, particularly on the northern front. So in public comments, Hassan Nasrallah has been the leader of Hezbollah, has been saying now, really for the past 6-7 months, that the chaos inside of Israel is what's finally going to bring down the Zionist entity. And it's not just rhetoric. Hezbollah has been doing a number of things on the northern border that are provocations that we really haven't seen in almost 2 decades. A few months ago, Hezbollah sent an operative over the border all the way down to Megiddo, who set a roadside bomb that badly injured one Israeli. When the IDF finally caught up to him, they found him in a car loaded with explosives and guns. And again, this was a Hezbollah operative who was directly sent across the border. Hezbollah has set up a number of tents across the blue line, which is the border recognized by the UN between Israel and Lebanon. Hezbollah removed one tent across the blue line a few weeks ago, but one is still there with Hezbollah operatives literally sitting in Israeli territory. There have been efforts to cross the border fence, to fly drones across the border fence. A couple of weeks ago, Israel ended up using stun grenades against Hezbollah operatives who were trying to cut a hole in the border fence. None of this is stuff that went on before a few months ago, and it is directly tied to this perception that Israel is falling apart, that the IDF is going to collapse, that society is too divided to really keep the state afloat. And so, it's Hezbollah. It's gonna be other Iranian proxies. They literally view this as their moment, and they view this as confirmation that everything they've been saying for decades is true. That Israel, is imminently going to be wiped out. And so I think it's very dangerous, in this moment from a security perspective, and we are seeing challenges to Israel that we have not seen before.
Michael, I have one last question for you from our community, from Patricia. How do we express our support for the Israeli people right now? What can we do?
So aside from raising our voices, aside from making sure that our American Jewish leaders and institutions support Israel in the streets, I think there are tangible things we can do. We can continue going to Israel and seeing what's happening on the ground for ourselves, and forming our own firsthand opinions, and going to the protests and standing alongside Israelis in solidarity and showing them that American Jews have their back. There are all sorts of organizations in Israel that are working to try and not only blunt some of the impacts of the judicial overhaul, but to make Israel a better, more just, more democratic, more equitable place. I'm not gonna list them here because I trying to stay as objective as I can given everything, but it's pretty easy to do research and find organizations that speak to you and support those organizations. And I would say most of all, I'll repeat what I said earlier. We should not turn our backs on Israel. We should not decide that this This is not a place that we identify with. We should not say that this is something that has no connection to our lives. We should not say that going forward, Israel and Zionism are not going to be parts of our American Jewish identity. I think this is a time to cling even more strongly to our Zionism, to cling even more strongly to Israel, and to demonstrate that our support for Israel is about this vision of Zionism that is Israel as Jewish and democratic, and that we are not going to turn our backs on it, even if that vision is under assault right now in Israel. We have to fight for the vision of Israel and for the Jewish state that we want, because we are Jews, and we have a stake there, and we should not give it up so easily.
Michael, I want to thank you so much for the generosity of your time, your wisdom, your spirit. We are extremely lucky to have you both here at Central and also in our broader Jewish community. I want to also thank all of you for hanging in there with us for this hour, getting up early and showing up. And I want to encourage you to really listen carefully to Michael's last comment, and also tell us how we can help you become better informed. We'll be happy to create programs, to think about resources. Remember that the Union for Reform Judaism has many resources available and is really fighting in the streets on this issue, on the broader question of religious pluralism in Israel. There's a lot of really good work being done, and I think the first step is for us to all stay informed. Thanks again to Rabbi Sarah Berman and to Marina Nebo, who has kept us technically connected this morning. I hope you all have a good day, and thanks again.
Thanks, everyone, and I hope you all have a meaningful Tisha B'Av.